Okay, welcome people who are watching this video. As a quick reminder, this group is called TRIG, the Technology Research Interdisciplinary Group. And parts of what we do is just explore the connection between humanity and technology. What does it mean? What are the implications? What kind of things can we build? How does it relate to research? And it's open to everyone. So if anyone watching is interested, just do a comment or email me and you're welcome to join. So today, what I'll be doing is be going over a paper that I found that I thought was kind of interesting. It's related to my own research, to things that I've been thinking about. It's related to the topics of sensory augmentation, of sensory substitution, all of those types of things. And so first I'll give like a quick introduction into a very quick introduction into sort of my research, what I was interested in. Then I'll talk about the paper. And then as a group, we are going to do our usual brainstorming jam session as I create a flow chart. Okay, so let me share screen. All right. So, for anyone that doesn't know me, I'm a research scientist in the Ashton Graybill Spatial Orientation Lab at Brandeis University. And I'm not going to go over any of the science explaining why this is the case, but I'll just describe it. So this is what I call a space flight analog condition. You could even call it a helicopter analog condition. And in this condition, where people are strapped into the machine is programmed to behave like an inverted pendulum, and all that means is that if you do nothing, it just sort of twists to one side or the other. And then the goal is to use a joystick and just keep yourself centered at that balance point, which is right, facing the camera. Because people are blindfolded, they are mostly relying on their vestibular system, which again, if you're curious about this, there are other videos that I've made that go into great detail. But long story short, you can't use gravity to figure out which way you're twisted. So whether you're twisted 10 degrees or 20 or 30 or whatever, your distance from gravity is always the same. They're always upright. So you can't use gravity to really help figure out where you are oriented. And this is going to be similar to what astronauts experience during that initial descent, when they go from 0G, where there's no sense of gravitational up, to as they're starting to land, they're going to have a very weak sense. And what we know is that in those conditions, people get disoriented. And sure enough, in this condition, the task that I'm doing here, within seconds, people will lose sense of where that center point is. And I've done this task a lot, so my deviations are pretty good, but most people will start to go crazy out of control and hit the crash boundary. So they get very, very disoriented. And again, this also will happen to helicopter pilots, for example, if they're sort of in darkness or flying through clouds or even close to the ground and a whole bunch of dust comes up, they can't see things properly, they're going to become disoriented. So this is a huge problem. One of the leading causes of death in military pilots, and really a big problem in any sort of aviation, is spatial disorientation. And it also has relevance to patients that have vestibular disorder. So okay, so this is what I studied. Okay, now one of the questions is, how do we solve this? How do we help people who can't use gravity to figure out which way they're oriented? And well, I should also say is that recently our group put on this event. There's a whole YouTube video just on that, where we're looking at pole dancing, which also has a very similar type of rotation. So if you're interested, you can check it out. But again, what's the countermeasure? How can we resolve this issue of people not knowing which way they are pointed? And one of the answers is, why not use technology? And this diagram over here, this image, this figure, is one of something called sensory substitution. This is an idea that's been around for a while. And in this, what you're seeing is, here's a person. This person may be someone who is blind. And on their head is a camera. And the camera is seeing an image. And what that camera does is it captures whatever's in front of them. For example, if there's a big X in front of them, the camera captures that. And then through a grid of little shocking devices that goes on your tongue. So this is a 12 by 12 shocking device. You put it on your tongue. If you see it, or if the camera sees an X in front of you, you then feel an X-shaped shock on your tongue. You feel that. And if you go through 100 hours of training or some, a pretty lengthy amount of training, what people claim is that those who maybe recently lost their vision with enough training began to feel as if they can almost kind of sort of see something. So it's kind of fascinating. And this is called, and the idea here is that, let's just say you recently got blind, your visual cortex, all of that stuff still works. So why not take the sensory information that would be going through your eyes and, let's say, feel it through tongue shock or through vibrations on your skin, and eventually through plasticity, your brain will make connections between the visual cortex to, like, these vibrations on your skin or the shocking on your tongue, and theoretically you activate it and you get something that's kind of similar. It's controversial to a certain extent, but experiments have shown that there are also benefits. Like, people can catch balls with this, people can identify objects with this. So there are some benefits, or many benefits, that can happen. Okay, on a like, I guess, like a less intense scale, what people have also done is place these vibrators on helicopter pilots who get disoriented. And same exact idea. This vibration may tell you where gravitational up is, or it may tell you, oh, your helicopter is drifting to one side or the other, and you don't know that that's happening. So people have tried these sorts of things as countermeasures. And really, in my task, the question is, would these vibrators help people understand their orientation in my space-like condition? And my next grant is sort of teasing apart some details in there. So one interesting thing, as I was just exploring the world, is that I came along this fascinating group of people. These are Australian Aborigines, and they're not the only tribe. There are other tribes out in the world that do this, but there are a few articles just on this group of people, and their language does not have words like left or right. Instead, everything is in reference to the cardinal directions. So let me just explain that, because it's like really fascinating. So let's say this water bottle is to my right. So if I'm talking to people, I'll be like, oh, look, the water bottle is to my right. And if I turn around, then all of a sudden I will say the water bottle is to my left. So it changes, based on which way I'm facing. But these people would say the water bottle is to the east. And even if I turn around, it doesn't matter. They would say the water bottle is to the east, which is like extraordinary, because what that means is that at every moment, these people need to know where north is, where west is, where east, west, all the directions they need to know at every single moment of their lives, which is extraordinary. And even their hellos and goodbyes encode this directional information. And there's some reports, although they're not maybe like detailed enough where one can really be like, yes, definitively they have better spatial orientation. But there are some reports that they have better spatial orientation. The reports that they can navigate way better than someone who does not use this language. So it's absolutely extraordinary that this exists and that they have these senses. Now, before continuing on, one of the things maybe we can talk about the brainstorming session is just comparing and contrasting. How is this language and this different than what the researchers did? Because what we're going to find is that the results are a little bit different. Here, this is working, but with the paper I'm going to share, the results may not be as striking as it is with this. So that's one deep question to ask. Like, what kind of training do you need to merge with technology or to acquire superpower like this, where you know where north is without having to use a compass? So after I learned about this, I came up with the idea of maybe creating a vibrotactile belt, a belt with just a bunch of vibrators around the waist that continuously reports the location of where north is as a training method, because I wanted this superpower. Like, I'm very, very poor at navigation. I get lost in Lexington, even though I grew up in Lexington. So I wanted this superpower so bad. But it turns out this idea people have already implemented, and they've implemented it in a very rigorous way. And so that's the paper I'm going to go over today. Now, before continuing, again, questions to maybe chew on as I go over this paper is, will vibrotactile training give people the same abilities and sense of north as these people? How long of a training do you really need? How sensory rich does this training have to be? Will there be too much of a dependence on the vibrations if you're using a vibrating belt, whereas the people in Australia, they're not using a belt? So do you become dependent on the belt? Or do you need training to be early in life? And some of the sensory substitution literature says that you don't necessarily have to, that the plasticity is lifelong and you can make these connections. But is it different for something like this? And also, another one that I thought of is this: in order for you to feel merged with these devices, does there have to be some sort of reward, of punishment, of some skin in the game, so that people make these sort of neural associations and connections with the technology? Is that needed or is it not? So those are just some questions I came up with. And then at the end, maybe we can come up with more. So here's the paper: Learning New Sensorimotor Contingencies, the effect of long-term use of sensory augmentation on the brain and conscious perception. So what they did is they built this device over here. They built this device here. So this is the belt. It's got 30 little vibrators on it, and you just put it around your waist. Now, what's extraordinary is that they built this device so that it's fMRI friendly. Because in this paper, I mean, this is a very thorough paper, they did EEG, they did fMRI, and they did behavioral stuff. So they went and they did a whole bunch of stuff, which is really, like, that's expensive. Like, it's hard to be able to do all that. And so what they essentially did is they had an experimental group. It was 9 people, and these 9 people wore the belt for all waking hours. For like 7 weeks, they had this belt on that was like vibrating north, like, whichever way you went, it always vibrated like a compass where north is. And they did this for 7 weeks, all waking hours, which is amazing. And then they had a control group, 5 people who did not wear the belt at all. Now, both groups did unsupervised navigational training. And I think all that means is that the directors of the program or the scientists weren't looking at what people were doing. They just said, go out there. They didn't give a lot of information, but this is what I'm imagining. They just said, go out there in the environment, spend about an hour and a half, and just do whatever you want to do, or do some, maybe they have a checklist or something, I don't know. And then on the side, they also gave outdoor training. And there's very little description on what that outdoor training was, but they said they did some sort of angle turning training. I don't know, maybe it's like turn to 45 degrees or 50, not a lot of description. And then also some sort of treasure hunting. So this is both groups did this sort of training. The control group were told to just observe how they navigate through, whereas the experimental group, who had this belt and they could use that belt to help them navigate, were asked to just pay attention to their space perception. And they kind of wanted to make sure that people were doing this unsupervised training properly, so they had people log that in. They also had people log in their motivation levels, which kind of refers to the reward and punishment. And they didn't find that there was any difference in the motivation levels in the survey, as reported by both of these groups. Okay. So there's some. This is not the smoothest PowerPoint because I just slapped it together. Okay, so some repetition. Okay. So homing task. So after they went through the training, this is how they were tested to see, like, okay, do they have the superpowers or not? They had 8 curvy polygons, and I'll just give you a kind of, these are sort of the polygons they had. They had a start, which is what the S's are, and then I guess someone walked with them this curvy polygon shape and stopped somewhere where the H is, right? So you start at the start point, you go through a guided walking tour, someone walks you through, they stop you at some point and then say, okay, now you have to walk back to the start point. And these people would then walk to the start point, but obviously they'd have some error. They would not be perfect at it. And so the distance between where they ended up and what the start point was, that was what the error was. That's how they detected how well were these people getting back. And obviously the control group just did it. And the experimental group could use their belt to inform them what to do. On top of it, which is kind of interesting, I guess to make it tougher, they gave people a cognitive load. And what that means is as people were trying to do this homing task of walking back to where they thought the start point was, they had to memorize numbers while walking. So I guess that made it tougher. And yeah, and I guess mostly what they measured was what was the difference between where they ended up and where they're supposed to go, the start point. Okay, so what do they find? And this, so this is a lot of work, okay? You fMRI people, you EEG people, you get people to wear something for 7 weeks, you bring them out into like the wilderness. I mean, this is like a huge, huge amount of work. And it's a lot of training time too, 7 weeks. So I was like, what's going to happen, right? Like, and just like, they found no significant differences between the people who had the belt on and the people who were in the control group, which is like, I don't know, like my heart would have broken, right? Like I would have been like, I mean, this was probably $1 million grant, or I don't know, like it was an expensive thing to do. And it's just like you put a lot of effort and time. This just shows you how brutal science can be. Like you put your heart and soul into it. It should work. Why didn't it work? Why didn't it work? Okay, that might be something that we discuss towards the end. I mean, it's just like 7 weeks. You have this belt on 8-9 hours a day. You're walking around. You're feeling where north is at all times. So why when you go on a curvy path, can't you use north to figure out where the start point is? So we'll talk about that maybe. Or yes, we will talk about it. So think about that. I'll let you guys sit on that for one more second because I also have to absorb it. 7 weeks. And just imagine yourself walking around. You're going to the supermarket and buzz, 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 and then you turn it's buzz on your back, and then it turn it's on, whichever way you're turning, and you always know where north is. And then you put in the forest, and you get training in the forest too, I think. You walk, and they're like, go back to start point. And you can use your buzzes. And then the person's like, okay. And they don't do any better than someone who does not have buzzes. Okay, so think about that. I'm almost done anyways with this. Okay, so so taken together, okay. So what they also did is they asked people the questions about like how, what was their space perception? Did it change with the belt? Did their trust and navigational ability change? Did their tactile belt perception change? Did their conscious belt perception change? So these are all survey questions. And what they found was that this did change. The longer the belt wearing participants wore the belt, the higher they rated all factors, indicating a continuous evolution of changes in subjective experiences over time. So having the belt on for that long meant that emotionally or whatever, they felt like they had greater trust in navigation and better sense of where they were in space. But in terms of actual being able to do a task, they didn't. And yeah, they also did a bunch of sleep EEG measurements, and I'm not going to focus on these things because they're not as much of a focus on what we talk about. But what it revealed is that the belt wearing group found a significant increase in REM sleep duration, indicative of procedural learning, and significant EEG signal power decrease, indicative of sensory motor processing early in the training period. So, maybe they were learning something, and then the fMRI measurements indicated that sensory augmentation by means of training with this belt involved differential activation patterns, including sensory areas, higher motor centers, the cerebellum, brain areas, known to be involved in navigation. So something maybe was happening in the brain, but not enough to help with this particular task. And again, these are questions that all scientists have to always ask. Like sometimes maybe the intervention or the thing that you're doing is not going to be best gauged by the task. So I mean, clearly something is happening here, and there must be some behavioral assay or experiment that would reveal it. This one was not able to. Why? Okay, So here's what they came up with. Why did the vibrotactile feedback after such a long period work? So first they said maybe the polygons were too complex for the homing test. Maybe, I don't know, if it's less complex, you can use the signal. Maybe after a while you lose sense, and then knowing where north is not useful. Then they said dual task maybe didn't work. But I don't know. So it was kind of confusing. And then they said that the polygons were of length 19 to 22 meters, and the path completion took less than a minute. So this is a scale where signals supplied by the vestibular system are still reliable. So it's possible the control group didn't even need the belt. Their internal sense of where the start point is from the vestibular system may have been sufficient. That's one idea. They did a similar experiment with longer paths and with late blind participants, and there they found that the belt helped. Okay, so these are some of my thoughts. That's pretty much the thing. And now we can start the brainstorming and see what different people's ideas are on why it didn't work. Or with the brainstorming, it could be anything. You know, Eric, anything philosophical from a reading, anything. Let's make sure that we don't just sit on the science world and really go and explore everything. So
could I read something from the paper just to get us started on a little bit of philosophy?
yes, please.
Section? Okay, so the first two paragraphs of the paper are about philosophy. So I thought it was cool. So this is just from the introduction of the paper. In recent years, theories of cognition underwent profound development in cognitive science. Classical views propose that cognition is precipitated by an internal representation of the outer world shaped by experience. The theoretical framework of cognition, however, fails to satisfactorily explain many aspects of cognition. As a consequence, the developing paradigm of embodied cognition attempts to provide an appropriate and productive framework. The paradigm of embodied cognition defines cognition as embodied action. Even though the approach of embodied cognition involves diverse notions, here cognition is understood as an activity that includes mind, body, and environment. Specifically, cognitive processes are conceived as being rooted in the body's interaction with the world involving perception and action. Embodied cognition in general is theorized as an active and multi-sensory programming of the environment. I just loved that. Quite honestly, I was like, oh yeah, that's, you know, I've been reading a lot about like cognitive science and that's just, I mean, that in itself, like, I think they went on to make it sort of like sciencey and engineering-y in ways that I wasn't so happy with, but I just felt like, because I've kind of been trying to understand that for myself. I've been like, you know, I was trying to get away from like, I think, therefore I am, to be like, no, I'm pretty sure my hand is here just as much as I'm sure I'm here. And how do I know that? Well, I know that through my senses, which are all connected to each other. And I'm actually connected to other things through my senses. And so like it's actually this very connected world instead of this disconnected world that you get with, you know, with the old way of looking at things. So I really liked that like basic notion, but then they kind of like did stuff that made it so it chopped up the world anyway. Like there was some sort of 3-letter acronym that like, then you have blah, 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 blahs that are your like, so like if you want to grasp something, that's one blah, 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 blah. And if you want to like hit something, it's another, you know, it's just like, instead of just being like, and I know science kind of has to be this way. It has to like divide stuff up, but I was just a little disappointed by like how it ended up being, I guess.
Yeah, you know, and I've actually, when I was reading the paper, I read through that part quickly, but now that you said it, it's actually really core to the idea of human augmentation. Now, I'm not sure if I've absorbed it completely, but let me see if maybe we can even embody definition.
Oh, those are pretty charts.
Was that?
That has pretty charts.
Those are pretty, yeah. It's a theory that many features of cognition, whether human or otherwise, are shaped by aspects of the entire body of the organism. The features of cognition include high-level mental constructs and performance. Yeah, you know, like I'm going to do a very poor job of explaining this, and I may not be explaining it right, and maybe only 1% of what I say is correct, so warning. But maybe the way I'm interpreting this is that the way that you move and interact with the world is part of how you process and experience and represent sort of like your identity. So, you know, to a certain extent, let's say that I change my body in some way, maybe like, yeah, I'm riding a bike all the time. Then because of the new set of sensory stuff or new set of experiences that I'm getting, the way I'm processing information is fundamentally changing. I don't know, is that, Erica, do you have a sense of what these two words mean, embodied cognition? Is that even, what are your thoughts? Or anyone else?
Yeah, well, I'll just say, like, I was thinking of it as like, so you can have a, like with a reflex, for instance, you can have like a loop, a input-output loop that does not involve the higher neural cortex, right? And so what I was thinking, like, I'm no expert in this at all. The thought that came to mind to me is like that sort of for more complex tasks, you can also kind of see it as there's a bunch of loops going on that are not all going to your brain, basically. And it's not just a up and then down thing. It's you know, it's involving a whole bunch of different systems that are not just in your brain.
I think so. And maybe, you know, I think part of what we're also saying here is that this could be like a whole session for next time where we actually read about this more and come up with multiple examples. And that might actually be really cool for us to do for a future meeting. You know, sort of as we're talking about it too, like I feel like I had talked to someone about embodied cognition and the idea of, like, you know, gravity and, you know, or really lack of gravity, you know, for example, or, you know, I should say, instead of lack of gravity, gravitation. For example, for astronauts, like, does that fundamentally change? Does that change your identity, your cognition / identity? So, okay, that's really cool. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that, Erica? Or was that? Oh, I see a chat coming up here. How do we define complex tasks? By definition, must they go through the brain? That's a good question.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's you know, I was just speculating, like maybe there's I wasn't really thinking it wasn't going through the brain, but the brain has a lot of different systems, so it's not necessarily going through like one system that's your consciousness, I guess. It could be, it's like a thing moving in a lot of loops. I don't know. Yeah. That's kind of the thing that I brought up earlier. Like, okay, we were a bunch of different loops and not necessarily just, and it's also that it also has to do with sensorimotor feedback. So it's like an interaction with the world. And so I'd be like, I'm just sitting here thinking, and oh, now the world's impinging on me. Oh, now I'm reacting. It's like, no, the whole thing has to do with interactions and reactions.
Yeah, and the only two things I'll add on is that there are systems that do complex things like slime molds, solving mazes, and they technically don't have brains, I think. And the other interesting idea that came up as we're talking, and now I've forgotten what it is. Okay, it will come back to it at some point. Oh, any other thoughts on embodied cognition? Oh, I was going to write instincts, reflexes. I mean, like, for example, building a nest. I mean, that's with the brain, obviously, but then it's not learned. Well, actually, that is with the brain. I don't know, but is that something? Okay, something for us to think about for a future meeting. Okay.
I had an idea regarding the homing task in the paper.
Yes.
Like, I was just thinking, and it reminded me of pigeons, because I know pigeons, like, they're able, like, you can like drive them really far away and they'll be able to go back and find the house where they're staying. So it'd be interesting to see how they do that, and if in some similar way humans could learn to do that.
Yeah, I mean, this could also, if you guys were interested, this could be a future thing that we look at. So I feel like very related to some of this sort of stuff with homing. There was like a paper I saw 2, 3 years ago. Maybe I've spoken about it, and I should refresh my memory. But they looked at sort of like pigeons using magnetic fields and superimposing that on their visual system. So the idea in this paper, I don't know how valid it is, but what they were proposing is that as pigeons are flying around, they actually are seeing magnetic fields in front of them, and they're able to use that. And in that same way, you could imagine in the homing test the humans are having, that if they can see magnetic field lines, maybe they'd be able to do it. What's kind of interesting with what you're talking about, and this sort of gets to the other question, is that the pigeons or other situations, they all have graded information. What I mean by graded information is that you have, like, you don't just have one point. Here's north, here's north, here's west, here's all the different directions and all the things in between. So you have a whole textured feeling of 360. So one question that I had was, is the problem that a single reference point is not enough for fully immersive, I don't know, superpowers to do what they're doing. And I'll give an example too. So in my task, where I put people in a condition, they can't use gravitational cues, they get very distracted by what they're doing. What I did in one experiment was I put a single beep right where the balance point was. So the people would be like twisting, and then every time they'd be at the balance point, they'd hear beep, and then be twisting again. So I thought that if they know where the balance point is, then people should perform better, right? Like now the confusion is gone, you know where it is. And surprisingly, the vast majority of people did not. So there was no statistical difference between people in my experiment that got a single beep in my condition where people are disoriented with those people that had no information. And what it really seemed like at that point was that what people need, what your otoliths are usually giving to you when you're tilting, is this sort of graded response. Like you're kind of close to the vertical, you're getting further, you're getting further, you're getting further. And you need that sort of graded response continuously to give you a sense of what's going on. So again, I mean, maybe the authors would say, look, people are getting continuous information about where north is, and that's changing over time. But maybe what they needed was something much more rich to be able to use. I mean, if I do a complex homing task and then you're like, there's north, it's going to be very difficult. The other problem, while we're on this task of sort of saying like why did it why did it not work, as I'm brainstorming, it's actually related to the pigeons too, is like landmarks, right? Like if I'm a control person, everyone had vision, everyone can see trees. Like what if you visually just sort of memorize people in the control group or whatever? Oh, this tree is sort of where I was, or the sun is over here, so I have a sense of where I am, and then they just do the task. So then why would someone with a belt do any better? These people have a sun, they could just use that. So why did it not work? Maybe because there were tons of visual cues that the control group could use to figure out the same information. So
did you, with your beeping thing, I'm just now imagining like a different way of doing the beeping, where instead of just one beep, it would go like beep, 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 beep. Did you try that? Or
So the next thing that we wanted to do was try different frequencies or higher beeping things. So I didn't try it, but Lila, who was in the lab, who also is a graduate of Lexington High, as Gwyneth, Dunmay, and Philip are, or I guess Dunmay is still in high school. So Lila, what she did is, instead of doing like a beep, 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 she does things similar, where she like she put like 2 microphones and then there's a sound source so that you would hear this beating sound. So like the faster you went, the more of a discrepancy you'd feel. So it was like it was a sound localization task, but it was similar in the sense that you could calculate where you were. And you know, a lot of difficulties came up on like how to accurately do that and stuff like that. But long story short, it kind of worked. So your intuition is correct. Like if you have that richer sense, then and you know a lot of that also comes in with like the discussions that we sort of had discussions with Tasha, who's blind and was in my machine and talks a lot about sort of in her journey, you know, wanting sensory information in what she calls in the right language, right? So maybe a beep at north is not the right language to build a type association, and really the right language is something that's more intuitive with what we expect or what we do. And this is a really good point too. So Punya is saying, well, you know, how continuous do you need to be? It's a really good point. So my point, I'll just put some information and put Punya's question there. My task provided only one reference point. And so okay, it's a really good point. And where, you know, where do we talk about the graded stuff? That was somewhere. Okay, whatever. Okay, whoops. Now it's okay. Look at that. What does that mean? I don't even know. But yeah, good point, Punya. I mean, like, it may be that the human doesn't need a fully continuous. Maybe you just need discrete amounts. You just need more discrete amounts. And it's a really, really good question. What is the minimal amount of information you need to perform really well? When does it become a distraction, right? So these are like, you know, believe it or not, these questions are not well understood in the field. So, you know, these could be all things that as we think about building our device, whatever it may be, and we do our experiments, these may be things that we can really explore and answer in our own way, which would be really cool.
I think it also kind of the point about continuity and discreteness, I guess, relates to our device with the dowel as well, because, you know, do you need that continuous sensation to maintain engagement, I guess, with the device, or do you need, you know, would it be enough to just get one push when you're, you know, at some position? I don't know.
It's a really good point. And people have also done, I mean, I know there is literature on reducing visual information too. So, you know, in visual information, not only would they reduce it, but then they can ask things like what happens. There are a lot of parameters, right? So what if you only have optic flow that's coming? You know, what information is the brain extracting from that? So there's so much information coming through your eyes or through your sensory systems. Patterns matter too. So it's actually really cool.
All right, now I want like a bracelet though that will like, so it's not like passively always telling me something, but like when I move my hand around, right? Maybe it's gonna like when I'm pointing north, the very center of the bracelet is gonna be lit up or buzzing or something, and then it'll sort of change as I move my hand. But like only when I'm doing something. So like it's just like a built-in compass, right? but then you have to like kind of learn to use it, because like I don't navigate by north south at all. I don't even know. Like I kind of figure out like, oh, I think the ocean's that way because downtown's that way because there's some tall buildings there. You know, this is like my level of understanding these things. So, and I literally took up a compass the other day, and I was having a hard time like, okay, I'm turning around and now the compass is moving and I can't even figure out which way it's supposed to move when I'm sitting there literally spinning around and the compass is spinning. So it's like, I almost don't have the sense at all, but I can navigate okay in my own way. But I make sure to know where my path is and stuff.
So let me, and I see a comment here, but let me address these. The first thing, we can build a bracelet. I mean, so this may be one of the things that we explore for those of you that want to build stuff. And we're getting closer to it. So this could be what we do. One of the benefits of creating this is that we have a rich literature backing it. And so we can say, look, this is what these people did. This is what these people did. Here's what we created. And here's what we're doing differently. And these are the questions that we're exploring that other people have not. So that it's actually kind of a beneficial to have like a vast literature to look at. The other thing sort of, and before I get to the chat comment, is these sort of two comments that came out of this. The first is you have to create a task to use it, you know, that is compelling. So one criticism maybe, or one observation for the task that these people were doing is, you know, everyone was equally motivated, but maybe they weren't motivated enough to bond. Let me just write this down. Maybe the participants were not motivated enough to bond with the device. Now, they do say that they bonded with the device, but again, this is a core question. Do you need a survival situation? Do you need intense punishment if you don't do something? Do you need intense reward if you do something?
Take away Google Maps and give them only a map that has north-south.
Yeah, right? Like do something. Like, how much does that really matter? We don't really have a good idea. There are not a lot of controlled experiments that have looked at it in this field, as far as I can tell. So this could be some really cool experiments for us to look at. How much does reward, and how do we control, modulate, affect, whatever, you know, how much reward a person gets. So in my experiments with the vibrotactors, I create a condition where they can't solve the problem unless they use the vibrotactors. You know, in this case, people can solve the problem without using vibrotactors. But in my situation, my training program, you can't, you have to use it. And so the idea then is that you build these connections, and then when you are in a disorienting condition, you'll be more likely to do it. And the other sort of thing is, again, and so then, like, why is it intuitive for the Australian Aborigine, I don't know how to spell that one, but why is it, you know, is it genetic? You know, is it genetic? Is it upbringing? You know, is it daily use? And in a way, if you think about it, reward and punishment, it kind of is daily use, right? And not only daily use, it's survival. Because, like, if you can't tell people even hi or bye, then you're not going to survive in that society. So to survive, you have to know where it is, and that necessity. The other thing I kind of, I guess, want to say from that, and then I'll stop my vomit of words here. Apologies, but there are a lot of cool ideas came. Is that there were accounts of I don't know, Western people who met with the tribe and eventually acquired similar abilities, right? So these people tried it over and over again. So it seemed like it wasn't maybe just genetic, that there was an element of training. Okay, let's see what's in the chat. Does lack of continuity decrease ability of merging with the device? Is this because senses are not discrete and provide, and this is a raging question. Are our senses providing continuous or intermittent control or feedback? And that's actually, in my lab, people talk about that. And in Computational Journal Club, Neuroscience Journal Club at Brandeis, people have talked about that. So it's actually an unanswered, but very good. Let me see where is this. Where is it? We are talking about this somewhere. Oh, right here. Oh, right here. Whoops. It's a very good question that we don't have an answer to. And maybe in our own way, we could explore some of this. So we don't know whether feedback or motor commands are continuous or intermittent. There are pros and cons for both methods. The system is very noisy. We don't know how it's going to respond. Intermittent control is better. So you send out packets or see what happens, and then you change it. Things like that. So there are interesting nuances. And there are computational models that sort of explore both of these things. It's kind of cool. So it's a good question. Any other thoughts or comments in the mix?
Adding on to the reward idea, maybe it negatively affected the people who had the north, like the homing north thing on all the time, because in their daily lives, maybe they just learned to tune it out because they didn't need to use it. And I think in the paper, they did mention something about EEGs at the beginning of the training. So maybe like they would actually do better at the beginning of the training than later on.
This is a really good point, because a lot of people, maybe they learn to tune it out is a really deep point that people make. Like they're like, oh, okay, if you put like vibrators on astronauts or whatever, maybe they'll just tune it out. The legit point. So at what point does continuous information become, you acclimate to it and you don't care? It's a really deep point. Don't have a really good answer because people haven't put it on for extended periods of time. At what point does it's the question, is at what point do you merge with it and automate the action? And at what point do you just ignore it? Is a good thing. Philip, so go ahead.
There's kind of a bigger point to this is like, like something like perfect pitch, for instance, like animals can respond to specific frequencies. And I think people with perfect pitch usually have learned something about the names of the notes, when they're very small children, and continuously like reinforce that through working on instruments and things. And then adults lose the ability to get that because we've like tuned out that entire sort of vector. We've solidified language across different voices rather than focusing on keeping that frequency information. So there could be something kind of similar going on where like you always are trying to ignore the irrelevant information. So unless something's very relevant. And I was also thinking with the Aborigines, like in terms of like reward and punishment, in a way, like I just don't like that wording for it because it's so much part of their culture that doesn't feel like a punishment in the sense of like I'm hitting you, right? It's not like I'm losing points in a game. It's like very, very natural. So I think just in terms of reward and punishment, to think of like how natural can you make it, how much integrated into a task you really want to do, like talking to someone.
Is a very good point. And Philip, I had seen you had unmuted.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was a study, a similar study where they used fMRI to investigate the contingencies on people who are learning this Aborigine language to see if to comparing it to people who don't know the language to people who do, and while they're speaking, if these sensory motors show up on the fMRI.
That would be an amazing That would be an amazing study. I should look into it more. I think unfortunately because the tribe is somewhat remote and there are very few members of it that like there are very few like rigorous studies done on them. But it would be like really interesting. The other alternative is to take normal people or like not normal, but like people who are not raised with that language and have them learn that language and then see what kind of changes happen for those individuals who show like they can actually acquire this amazing skill. So that might be like a really interesting thing. Yeah.
I also just wanted to add, speaking of merging with the device, what's an accurate way of measuring merging with the device? I mean, because when we were doing our little mini experiment, we were kind of asking people, right? Like, did you feel merged with the device with the light experiment we had done? And I don't know that that's the most accurate way to do it because of course people have different judgment of how good it is, but then is looking at something like, I don't know, how the brain works scientifically, is that the right way, or do we want more, I don't know, neuronal stimulation or less and things like that?
Yeah, and that's a really great point because like because what's really cool about this paper is that they were pretty rigorous with trying to get different ways of seeing if something's happening. So they did the questionnaires, and everyone can say the questionnaires are a bit dubious because like, people can just say whatever they want to. Is it rooted in reality? The brain scans were cool. I don't understand, to be honest, brain scans all that well because my training isn't in that. So I don't know like how to critique it. Like, is the learning that they saw similar to other types of learning? Like if I'm playing the piano or if I'm doing other stuff, maybe it is. And then maybe playing the piano is like a type of human augmentation or whatever our vocab word was before, embodied cognition. I don't know. So I don't know like how different those activations are from other things that a person's exposed to or learning. And I don't know how significant it is, if it's just a subtle significance or a lot. But the brain scans seem interesting just in the sense that, okay, something changed, I guess. And then with the behavioral, it's always a question of maybe something changed, but the task was more focused on what they learned. Maybe it was a simple pointing task, but then again, maybe that's too simple. But then that would show it. Really awesome. So we're at 9. Any other thoughts? This is a really good brainstorming session.
Just adding on to the last point, I think the paper did mention something about the people who had the device on said they felt more subjective new experiences, right? Something like that, even though there was no actual difference in the performance.
Yeah, it's true. So there were like 4 or 5 different metrics that they had on the questionnaire, and everyone who was in the belt group, reported, increase in those skills. It was cool, and maybe their brains showed it, and a different behavioral measure would report it. Maybe. Sweet. All right. Well, really awesome. Let me stop recording.